I want to express appreciation for the team that has formulated this program, especially our tech people, Ethan Mann and Paula Nettleship, and also all the Pax Christi participants this evening. It's certainly one of the missions of Pax Christi USA and our local group to work with the Archbishop in sharing this material. The session is to be recorded and it will be available to you on our APP website and on the new APP YouTube. Now I want to just, I also want to give thanks to Andrea Wallowek, who does our slides as well. So she's been very faithful to us. Let's have the slide in which we'll show what we will accomplish this evening. We will begin with an opening prayer, presentation by our keynote speakers, open forum with Q&A, closing remarks, and closing prayer. I ask that you have questions, that you place them in the chat or use the reaction function and raise the hand or raise your hand, and Jim Ruck and I and myself will call upon you. And once again, you'll all be muted until you want to speak, and then we'll unmute you. I now invite Mike Pastorkovich to offer an opening prayer.
Let us pray. O God, creator of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible, and who so loved your visible creation that you chose to become a part of it by taking on matter in the form of flesh and joining the human race in the person of your Son, Jesus Christ. It is a human race damaged by sin, and a human race which has learned the art of murder from Cain, and which in the fullness of time murdered your Son rather than embrace the gospel of peace which he brought into the world. Since the time of his incarnation, our human race has so refined Cain's art of murder that we now have the capacity to kill hundreds of millions of our sisters and brothers in a few moments, and billions more of the non-human creatures that you made and put here to share the earth with us. We have lunatic leaders who believe a nuclear war can be won, and distracted, overburdened masses that have been duped into believing that the danger of a nuclear holocaust has passed with the demise of the Soviet Union, when in fact the danger has never been greater. We ask that you stay the hands of the lunatics and focus the minds of the overburdened and distracted on the reality of the danger we face and the reality that nuclear war would be an unmitigated catastrophe, and that nuclear weapons have absolutely no place on our planet or in our lives. We ask you, Blessed Mary of the Immaculate Conception, whose cathedral by that name was used as the aiming point and subsequently destroyed by the atomic bombers of Nagasaki, to intercede on our behalf to the Father through your Son, and ask Francis of Assisi to intercede on our behalf, or rather on behalf of the non-human creatures he so loved and cared for. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus Christ, our brother and our true leader. Let us all pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Mike. And now I want to introduce Mimi Dara, who is the co-facilitator of our local Pax Christi group, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Barbara. Archbishop John Wester is the Archbishop of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he's the author of the pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a Conversation Toward Nuclear Disarmament. He is here tonight as a prophet in our midst. Several weeks ago, Richard Rohr, in his daily meditations, reflected on what a prophet is. Richard said, "One way to define a prophet is a person who sees so clearly what is happening in the present moment that he or she can tell us what is going to happen if we don't change immediately and radically. Archbishop Wester is such a prophet when he calls us to look clearly at the situation of nuclear weapons and nuclear war." Rohr also said that what the prophet dares to do is to step into the middle of the dominant consciousness and create an alternative, a new set of possibilities. There's a different way of looking at this. And of course, what the prophets presume is that the way they are sharing the way they are sharing with us is the way that God looks at it. Archbishop Wester is such a prophet. Pope Francis, during his recent pilgrimage to South Sudan, said, "The gospel must not be just a beautiful religious philosophy, but a prophecy that becomes reality in history." Archbishop Wester can help us work to make nuclear disarmament a reality today. Archbishop Wester, thank you for being a prophet in our midst with a message that our church and our world needs.
Thank you very much, Mimi. You're very gracious in your introductory remarks. I'm very grateful to you. I'll do my best to live up to those kind words. I have to say, though, that it's not just me. Tonight, we're very blessed to have with us Jay Coughlin, who is the executive director of Nuclear Watch New Mexico. And so we're going to be co-presenting, and I've been asked now to introduce him as well. I'll go first, and then Jay will follow. As I say, Jay is the executive director of Nuclear Watch New Mexico. And actually, he is one of the guiding lights on our writing team for the pastoral letter. So I'm letting you in on a secret that Jay is extremely instrumental in the writing of the pastoral letter. And there are several others as well who were part of this. It's impossible for one person to do such a huge project as this. And I'm very grateful to Jay. Jay's given a great majority of his life to nuclear disarmament. He is indefatigable here in New Mexico in bringing up the reality and the truth. We talk a lot about false narratives these days and about fake news. And Jay is an extremely dedicated man, dedicated to the truth, dedicated to the huge danger that nuclear weapons pose for all of us on our planet, our common home. And he's really an expert in these matters. He's quite humble man, an authentic man who speaks the truth. And we're just very blessed in New Mexico to have someone like him to be able to have the courage, really, to speak the truth in the midst of the Los Alamos laboratories, Sandia laboratories, and of course, Lawrence Livermore in California. He's also a dedicated rock climber, a mountain climber. So he does seem to associate himself with very dangerous kinds of things, but he enjoys the latter very much and is doing all he can, as we all are, to get rid of the former. I want to thank you, Michael, for that beautiful prayer. That was a very touching and very beautiful prayer. Thank you for that very much. I'm pleased to see that one of the recommendations for our time together tonight was to take a look at John F. Kennedy's what's called the Peace Speech at American University on June 10th, 1963, shortly before he was assassinated. I'm struck by the parallels between the speech, the peace speech of President Kennedy, and our pastoral letter. I must say that in watching the speech, it brought back many happy memories and sad memories, but good memories of a bygone era where people dreamed big and reached for the stars, and where our leaders followed their hearts and conscience and not just polls. Now, that's a broad statement, and we didn't have perfect politicians then, and it doesn't appear we have them now. But the point is that it did, and maybe I'm just biased, but I was born in 1950, and it just seemed like there was, we had Khrushchev and USSR and Pope John the 23rd and John F. Kennedy in the White House. It seemed to be an interesting time, a conflation of leaders coming together at that time. It was also a time, of course, when the threat of nuclear weapons was real, where the Cold War was real, and where 1962 was real. And so I just wanted to briefly, before Jay's presentation, just to give some themes that I think are important for us to keep in mind. And these are themes which I perceived in JFK's talk, his peace speech, and in the pastoral letter. So I'm just going to touch lightly on these themes, and then maybe we can flesh them out more in the Q&A. The first theme I think that for me is very important, and is that there's absolutely no way to talk about peace, world peace, without talking about the nuclear disarmament, verifiable, multilateral, worldwide nuclear disarmament. And John Kennedy's speech, the central topic of everything he had to say was that we've got to move toward nuclear disarmament. It's critical, it's essential. There will be no peace as long as there's nuclear arms in our world. That's just a fact. And this is something we brought out in our pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a conversation toward nuclear disarmament. It's a key element. And the part of the main points of the letter is to have a conversation about heightening an awareness of this issue, that we've been lulled into a false sense of complacency since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And again, it's not an easy topic. This is not easy to engage people in this topic. I often tell people I feel like a skunk at a lawn party. People are afraid to look at it, or they believe that somehow we're protected by deterrence, which I'll say a little bit more about later. The point of the letter, and Kennedy, what he initiated was this conversation really about nuclear disarmament. A second point, of course, that he makes in the speech, he does go into the destructiveness of nuclear weapons. Of course, this is back in 1963. Imagine today in 2023, anything that the president then said about the destructive power of nuclear weapons is just magnified by incredible proportions. And Jay will speak to this. And the pastoral letter does that as well. We go into the incredibly powerful weapons that we have today. And that does, of course, and now even, continuing, we have these hypersonic delivery systems, and we have this artificial intelligence that are fitting into the equation. And so the threat of these powerful weapons is even worse than 1963, of course. And I just can't imagine in my own mind the destructive power, how, as Michael said in his prayer, how in just a few moments we can destroy all of civilization as we know it. We've come to a point in our world affairs, in our human history, that's really, it's untenable, and it's something that needs to be addressed. So the next theme I would say is that we need leadership. We need strong leadership in this regard. We need leaders who understand the issue and are willing to courageously stand up. As I mentioned earlier, we had Chairman Khrushchev, and we had Prime Minister Macmillan, and Pope John the 23rd, and President Kennedy. And many of them were not the Pope, but there were those political leaders agreed to high-level discussions that the president was talking about, President Kennedy, on a comprehensive test ban treaty. He said beautifully, he said, our hope must be tempered. Our hopes must be tempered with the caution of history, but with our hopes go the hopes of all mankind. He said, to make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. Well, this was a bold step. This was to me, when I heard that, he was really taking a leadership position and announcing this in the midst of that speech. And this is something that we're calling for here in New Mexico and through our pastoral letter as well, the need for the nuclear states to enter into renewed agreements, that the US must, we believe, take a leadership role in bringing about verifiable multilateral disarmament. The pastoral letter brings out the fact that here's Kennedy in 63 saying we're not going to test in the atmosphere. And here we are today, this very day, at Los Alamos Labs at my archdiocese, developing new pit cores. And of course, those would be untested. The nuclear arms we have now are tested. If we were to start testing those, then that would certainly violate the testing ban treaty and create even more problems. So leadership is a big, and I know that that's something that the Association of Pittsburgh Priests is concerned with as well. How do we get leaders? How do we get to our leaders? And how do we convince our leaders that this is where, we want to go, where we need to go as a human race? Another theme that comes up in John Kennedy's speech and in our pastoral letter is the importance of relationships. And I think this is key to our work, how we relate to one another. We see this in our country today, of course, with the polarization and with calling people names publicly, with high officials, using terms that a sophomore in high school might use in the school. I don't want to demean sophomores in high school. I don't know that they would use these either, but And in the speech of Kennedy's speech, he took some time to speak of the importance of not demonizing people, of seeing them not as the enemy. He made clear that the United States in 1963 does not accept communism, but that we do see the people of the then USSR as individuals. I was struck by that in his speech. He said significantly that no government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. We can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture and acts of courage. This is another point of our pastoral letter, that we need to have right relationships. And the letter goes into some detail of the Judeo-Christian paradigm of right relationships, of conversing with one another. That this is how God meant for his creation to be, for God's creation to be, that we are all in right relationships with each other. And the letter brings out too, and I think this fits into what JFK said, that instead of talking honestly with people and respecting them, nuclear weapons have been developed in secrecy. They're cloaked in secrecy, and they're cloaked under the guise of false narratives, saying that we need these weapons to protect ourselves, for deterrence, for example, and for not being transparent about what our real war plans are and our first strike plans are. Every citizen in the planet has a stake in this conversation of nuclear disarmament. And so we all have to be involved. We all have to see that it's an urgent for all of us to be involved, to do whatever it is that we can do, and to give people action items. Our letter does do that. We give people very positive, specific steps that they can take that would help in this important work. We know, even looking at the latest nuclear posture review of the Biden administration, that it's woefully inadequate and not in keeping with President Biden's earlier promises. I wonder how many people are aware of this nuclear posture review. How many have input into it? There's the old saying, the old wise saying that we're as sick as our secrets. And our nuclear secrets have made the world a very, very sick place. I think we have to get beyond that, and everybody needs to be involved, and our leaders have to be more transparent. This is what develops right relationships. I think another important aspect, and this is one that we're working on and here in Santa Fe, is the financial questions of nuclear weapons. Now, clearly, I think as all of us are concerned with nuclear disarmament, we have to look to there's a financial question. They say follow the money, don't they, a lot of times? There's big money involved, obviously, in nuclear weapons, huge money. It's to say that we have to disarm nuclear disarmament, you can imagine the very wealthy organizations and individuals who smirk and laugh, and they'll say, well, that'll be the day. But so that's one issue. Another issue is that all this money that is being spent on nuclear weapons is depriving the poor. It's a terrible waste of money, an incredible waste of, not just because of the overkill that we've achieved now with about 13,000 nuclear weapons in the worldwide, but in terms of just the fact that any money spent on such research is going to be huge money, financial outpour, and it's going to deprive people. Kennedy made mention of this in his speech. He said quite clearly how this money could be used to combat disease, medical advances could be gained, education, and a host of other benefits. And so he says that we're caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counter weapons, end quote. So this is something that we bring out in our letter. And just interestingly, even since the letter, this fiscal year, if I'm not mistaken, and Jay can correct me later, but I think that Los Alamos will receive $9.4 billion this fiscal year for their research, which is greater than the entire budget of New Mexico, which is just a little over $8 billion. So we are conscious of the importance of jobs. We believe that there's a lot of good material, a lot of good data to be had on this. We believe, too, that a lot of jobs would be created with nuclear disarmament because we would have to have verifiable strategies to make sure that there was indeed, as Reagan said, trust but verify. So I think that this is something that we really need to concentrate on as a movement, as we work on this very important project. And so that again was in the speech and in our letter. I was also, I thought it was interesting that Kennedy was very prevenient. And when he was talking about, he said in his speech, for in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. I think he put the nuclear arms race in perspective, that, we're living here on Mother Earth, as Pope Francis calls it, our common home. And nuclear weapons are the ultimate threat to this common home that we have, our planet Earth. And that's why, and Jay may mention this too, I really see this nuclear disarmament as a vital pro-life issue. I don't know that we tend to think of nuclear disarmament as a pro-life issue specifically, and I think we have to start doing that more and more. And we have to bring the same urgency that the Catholic Church brings to pro-life issues, we have to bring to nuclear disarmament. Because to frame it in one way, it's the ultimate pro-life issue. It's the ultimate power that can destroy all of life. Life in the womb, life at the end, all of life, and all sentient beings. And so we quote, I won't do it now, but we quote liberally from Pope Francis and others on this point. Another reaction that I've gotten so far in my coming onto this cause just recently, many of you have been doing it far longer than I, is that people look at me kind of with almost a smirk and kind of saying, well, that's very nice, but frankly, you're a little bit naive, you should go home and, play chess and we'll leave the to us politicians and all that. That's kind of a scary thought to me. I think that all of us need to be involved in our future and all of us need to be speaking on these matters. And I don't think it's at all naive. Jay Coughlin is I'll say it for him. He loves, and this is coming from him. He said, well, you're just naive. You're too idealistic, someone once said. You don't live in the real world. Putin, Russia, China, terrorism. This is the real world. But who is it, Jay says, that's really naive? He quotes Robert McNamara, the defense secretary during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, who said that human civilization survived only by luck. Counting on luck is not a winning strategy. The history of nuclear weapons is replete with near misses, miscalculations, and accidents. With the war in Ukraine, we are now facing the most serious nuclear threat since the middle 1980s. Is it not the height of naivete to think that humanity can survive on into the future as long as nuclear weapons exist? So I think this is something that we have to confront. I think I confront this myself personally every time I open my mouth on this issue, because I realize that people do see us, frankly, as being naive, as being people who are hopelessly have our heads in the clouds. So I think we have to confront that and realize, A, that nuclear disarmament is not naive. It's far more naive to have nuclear weapons. And B, that our strategies are real, that communicating with people, building relationships, not treating people as the enemy, but with dignity and respect, listening to people, coming together to converse on every single level, including the international level with the United Nations and all world leaders, religious leaders, civic leaders, business leaders, that this has got to be something that we do. We've got to start learning as a human race that bombs do not solve our problems. All bombs do is kill people. And then they leave us with the cleaning up afterwards and realizing, why couldn't we have come to this before the first soldier, the first civilian was killed? I think also that in our JFK speech and in our letter, we do speak to hope. I think it's important that we leave people with hope when we talk about these issues. Yes, it's true that I do feel like a skunk at a lawn party, or what's the old saying, bird droppings in a punch bowl. Can I say that in polite company? It is a difficult topic, but it's also a topic filled with hope. I was very struck by Kennedy saying this in his speech. He said, I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs, being the USSR. And every graduate of this school, the American University, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his or her own attitude toward the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. These are words of hope, to examine our own attitudes. And our pastoral letter does that as well. We refer to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and also to the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And to say that we need to reignite these, as someone said earlier, within 1,000 days, where I was in another meeting just recently, within 1,000 days, I think Jay can clarify this in the Q&A, I think we're going to be ending all of our treaties. It's looking very, very dismal. So we have to have hope. We have to continue to have hope that Christ is enlightening us and that our message, ours is a gospel message of peace. So I'm very grateful for this JFK speech. I encourage all of us to go online and hear it if you haven't yet. I think it really is filled with a lot of hope. I realize there are a lot of difficulties to what we're doing. I'm going to end with this. We have a difficult road ahead. And here's what I've been discovering and kind of grappling with. People, first of all, tend to ignore this issue. They think it's either too difficult, too scary. They seek refuge by just ignoring it. And so I think it's hard to break through that. People's defense mechanisms are very well established. And we have been lulled into a false sense of complacency. And it's true that Ukraine did, and initially last February 24th, it did start to raise fears of that regard. But notice that even now, all those fears are subsiding, it seems to me. And people are saying, oh, okay, well, the war is almost a year old, and it looks like we're going to, Putin's not going to do anything stupid. It looks like we're going to be okay. And so I think that we have to recognize that it's difficult to break through to get people to really look at this important issue. I think I've also been told by people, and I understand the point. I do not dismiss it. People said, look, Archbishop, I was talking to a group of ecumenical leaders that our people are dealing with violence in the streets and drug addiction and poverty and racism and systemic racism. Many of our people are being shot and killed. A Black man in our country, his life expectancy is much lower than a white man. So that's another issue. Is they say, well, yeah, what you say is important, but we have more important issues to deal with right now. Another thing that I think we have to confront is that people individually do not feel empowered. They feel that they don't have, what good does it do me to say anything? So I think we have to combat that as well and let people know that it's important for us to be able to, everybody has something to say. I've already mentioned the jobs. I think that's an issue we have to look at soberly and realistically and get data on that so we can show that we do believe the jobs, and I do believe that strongly, that we do have jobs that will be had in the disarmament posture. I think we have to fight this kind of desire for the U.S. to be number one. We heard this particularly with the last administration, making America great again. That's not a gospel message. That's a gospel of domination, of colonialization, in my opinion. America is great when it's a nation that's welcoming and hospitable and that engages with right relationships. So I think we have to fight that compulsion in our country that we need to be superior, that we're the biggest superpower in the world. Having nuclear weapons does not make us a superpower. It makes us a super threat. And I think that we need to combat that. I think we have to have trust in the word, the spoken word. The word became flesh, and that we are echoes of that word as Christians and as people of other religions, that we have the word of God to speak. And so I think we have to trust in that. So these are just some of the things that I would say that, there are other things too, but in the interest of time, I want to wrap it up. There are urgent things going on in our world today, obviously, Ukraine, US and Russia, China and Taiwan and spy balloons, Iran and Israel, Pakistan and India and North Korea. These are very urgent realities that we have to deal with. And they just, to my mind, make our cause and this movement of nuclear disarmament even more urgent and even more real. Pope Francis never tires of dialoguing. That's why he started the Synod, that we need to listen to the Holy Spirit working in the people of God, that we need to have faith in the word, that the pen is mightier than the sword. And so I would just end with this little reflection from our pastoral letter, and I think JFK would agree with it. In his reflections on the Gospels, Pope Francis often highlights the nonviolent Jesus and the themes of blessed are the peacemakers and love your enemies. He has called on us to practice gospel nonviolence. Therefore, we invite us to step into the light of Christ and walk together toward a new future of peace, a new promised land of peace, a new culture of peace and nonviolence, where we all might learn to live in peace as sisters and brothers on this beautiful planet, our common home. Thank you very much, and God bless you all. Now I'd like to invite Jay to give his presentation, and then we'll open it up for some questions and answers. Jay, please.
Okay, thank you, Archbishop. I'm sharing the screen first, I hope, and go here. Alrighty. And go back up. Okay, is that good? Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up. You know, I want to start with the fact that Archbishop Wester and I think we're deeply in a mutual admiration society here. He's just such a wonderful man, and I have deep affection for him. I call ourselves the odd couple. That's just kind of the way it is. We occasionally even have fun together and have some laughs together, even amongst and inside this difficult and somewhat gloomy subject. He's also the right man at the right time in the right place. To be the Archbishop of the Santa Fe Archdiocese, which has more money spent in it than any other diocese in the country. And that's because of the presence of two of the nation's 3 nuclear weapons laboratories, and that's Los Alamos and Sandia, plus the nation's largest repository of nuclear weapons is within his diocese. So again, he's the right man at the right place at the right time. And I think this odd couple can go on to do some great things. But I'm not Catholic, but Archbishop Wester just idealizes everything of what I think a Catholic priest and official ought to be. And, you know, I'm just deeply grateful for my association with him. And then having said that, as the Archbishop noted, I will correct him when necessary. I'm the fact guy. He said something pretty remarkable, but I need to qualify one thing. He pointed out how the Department of Energy is going to spend $9.4 billion at the Los Alamos National Laboratory this year. That's not correct. It's $9.4 billion in the state of New Mexico. But the remarkable part is the entire operating budget for the state of New Mexico, which is the 3rd poorest state in the nation, is $8.5 billion. So what the Department of Energy is going to spend in the land of enchantment is 10% bigger than the state's entire operating budget. That gives you an idea of what we're up against economically and on the jobs problem that the Archbishop alluded to. 70% of that money is for core nuclear weapons research and production programs, while much of the remainder is for dumping resulting radioactive waste. And then before I get going here, I'll just, my presentation is somewhat heavily technical. I'm not going to give you all a pop quiz on it. It's my attempt to just kind of make it real, put meat on the bone. But to set the tone, I'm going to start with, there we go, with a forward. I just kind of want to set the screen. And I'm starting with a quote by Pope Francis. where he talks explicitly about what the Archbishop alluded to, how about the incredible amounts of money we're putting into nuclear weapons, robs from the poor. And that's one thing I admire about the Catholic Church. It's consistent theme of providing for the poor, and how basically the merchants of death rob from the poor. And I find that sentiment, well echoed by President Eisenhower in his famous Cross of Iron speech. And I just think that's so eloquent that every gun that's made is a theft from those who hunger and then are not fed. And then finally, the little billboard that you see to the right, that is a direct quote from Pope Francis. Now, interestingly, that billboard is something that my organization put up. That's on tribal land, San Ildefonso. As you cross the Rio Grande, it's immediately on the right, on the way up the hill to the Los Alamos lab. And it's on a piece of land that was immortalized in the book, The Bridge at Ottawa. I recommend that book if you can remember it, The Bridge at Ottawa. That's about how Los Alamos Lab came to this area of New Mexico. Now, getting into, I'm starting to get somewhat technical here, kind of the overall theme of my talk is the new nuclear arms race. And of course, somebody's already referred to the war in Ukraine in the chat. I will underscore that Ukraine, in my view, is really changing everything. I personally think it's the biggest geopolitical event since the end of Cold War, even superseding 9/11. And the news is not good. I want to assure you that I'm a happy person. I have lots of fun, but I'm going through a whole litany of bad news here. The countries that you see, China, India, Korea, Pakistan, Russia, and the United Kingdom, they're all quantitatively expanding their nuclear weapons stockpile. The US is not, but I would argue it is definitely qualitatively changing its stockpile. We have China building some new 600 new ICBM silos, that's intercontinental ballistic missile silos. We have a very alarming new policy of the North Korean government is if Kim Jong-un was assassinated, there'd be automatic nuclear retaliation. The targets are not specified, but that's really a step up in escalation. And then finally, the United States has officially adopted a new national defense strategy of, for the first time, having two, not one, but two near-peer nuclear adversaries. That's China being added to Russia. So as a result, the already bloated US nuclear weapons budget is going to be further increased. So on the US side of things, we still have some 3,750 actively deployed nuclear weapons. Our dismantlement rates, the public doesn't know this, but they're pathetic. They're roughly on the order of 25 warheads a year. We got a backlog of some 2,500 warheads to dismantle. We are rebuilding existing nuclear weapons with new military capabilities, and we're going to start producing new designs as well. We have built or are building new production plants expected to be operational until 2080. And the US government is buying from the usual fat cat defense contractors new heavy bombers, submarines, and ballistic and cruise missiles. The Archbishop has already alluded to this. In my view, this second nuclear arms race is more dangerous than the first. And that's because instead of just having two nuclear powers and, the former policy of mutually assured destruction. And of course, I want to emphasize the acronym MAD because it is insane. But whereas it used to be just the US and USSR, we now have 9 nuclear weapons powers with competing interests. So it's far more complex. There's more chance, and this is partially as a result, there's now more chance of a regional nuclear war. I was very interested to, within the last week, hear ex-Secretary Pompeo say, he was making the claim that it was basically the US that intervened and prevented a regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan. So that's incredibly alarming. We had the fact that Al-Qaeda or ISIS could acquire nukes. We have the development of hypersonic weapons, cyber attacks. That's a whole new dimension that we did not have in the first Cold War. Adding just, if you view the old Cold War as kind of playing a game of chess, given cyber and these other threats, it's almost like we're playing 3-dimensional chess now in averting nuclear war. And coupled with artificial intelligence, which is being rapidly deployed. Archbishop Wester already alluded to a nuclear posture review. That's something that every incoming administration does. And what I'm getting at is the myth of deterrence that I grew up with. And by the way, I grew up as a US Army brat and was, just always from a young age, well aware of military affairs, and particularly the role of nuclear weapons due to the influence of my father, who was a full colonel in the Army. But the take-home point I want to make with respect to the rationale of deterrence is we've never had only deterrence. We've always had a hybrid of deterrence plus maintaining nuclear warfighting capabilities. And that's why we have thousands of weapons instead of just the few hundred needed for only deterrence. And then finally, to bring it to today, Putin has in effect turned the notion of deterrence on its head. After all, it's his nuclear weapons that have enabled him to invade Ukraine. I would contend that if he didn't have nukes, that NATO and the US would have more forcibly intervened by now. Okay, now because these warfighting capabilities that I was talking about, the US is already about 5 years into a new $2 trillion modernization program for nuclear weapons. And, I'll just refer you back to how all this robs from the poor, robs from societal needs. Completely new intercontinental ballistic missiles, new cruise missiles, heavy stealth bombers, submarines at, costing hundreds of billions of dollars. Rebuilt warheads with new military capabilities, new designs, as I said earlier, and a perpetual cycle of life extension programs. That's the official name for giving existing weapons another 30 years or so of service lives. So in short, it's nuclear weapons forever. Here I get a little too wonky, perhaps for my own good, or just to show off or whatever, but I can rattle off all of the various kinds of warheads. But you can see that they're all being worked on. They're all having their lives extended. The B-61-12 is of particular interest right now. It is the world's first nuclear smart bomb. That means it can be guided on the way down for greater accuracy. And it's going to be forward deployed in Europe very soon. And the Russian government is already well aware of this. So I'm not going to go on at length about the warheads. Just know that every warhead that's planned to be in the future stockpile is very much being worked on now. I previously mentioned that the US has built or is building production plants for nuclear weapons expected to be operational until 2080. And think of that. The US is planning on producing new weapons for the next 50 years, 55 years. I note the various plants, the Kansas City plant that produces all of the non-nuclear components, and that's stuff like fuses, radars, parachutes, et cetera, et cetera. It's the highly enriched uranium at the Y-12 plant near Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And then at the Los Alamos lab, which I can look out my window and see, by the way, about 20 miles away, around 15 billion is being spent for upgraded plutonium facilities. And then we're going to have a new plutonium bomb core facility at the Savannah River site in South Carolina that's going to cost greater than 20 billion. And that, by the way, will be the second most expensive building in human history. So the amounts of money are just incredible. No need to belabor this slide too much. I just wanted to make it very clear what the central mission is of Los Alamos National Laboratory in its own words. Here locally, we always hear a lot of soft propaganda about all the other things that the laboratory does. But bear in mind the obvious. This is the central mission of Los Alamos Lab, right there. Here's a look at the budget request, and you see the tremendous growth of nuclear weapons programs at Los Alamos over the last couple of years. And I haven't done it, but I could put up a nearly similar budget graph for Sandia Labs, which is adjacent to Albuquerque. So again, two of the three nations' nuclear weapons labs are here in northern New Mexico. But look at that growth in nuclear weapons programs and compare it to, for example, non-proliferation programs, which could help avert the threat of a nuclear war. Look at it compared to cleanup. Los Alamos Lab calls itself the premier scientific institution in the world. Look how small actual science programs are in reality. And Archbishop Wester said something to the effect of money talks. I like to quote Bob Dylan, who says, money doesn't talk, it swears. And so definitely of the follow the money school. The key thing, the key operation in this $2 trillion modernization is the expanded production of plutonium pit bomb cores. And the Pentagon, by the way, has identified expanded pit production as the #1 modernization issue. And a pit, briefly put, again, is the core of a nuclear weapon. It implodes, it's high explosives that makes it implode. It becomes fissile, which in turn transports radiation to the secondary, which undergoes fusion. And that's what creates the incredible destructive yields of today's thermonuclear weapons. But a pit can be an atomic bomb by itself, as Nagasaki showed. But the US has not had industrial scale pit production since the Rocky Flats plant was shut down in 1989 by a FBI raid investigating environmental crimes. And by the way, the grand jury report coming from that raid was sealed by the US government, and the indictments against both DOE and the operator were quashed. But that's a whole nother story. So the current plan by the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is a semi-autonomous agency within the Department of Energy, It's to have 30 or more plutonium pits per year produced at the Los Alamos lab, and 50 or more pits per year at the Savannah River site in South Carolina. The latter is now delayed to 2036, and the costs are climbing. And you can see that Biden's fiscal 2023 budget for pit production was increased by 40%. That was his request. And then Congress went and added another $500 million to it. So the money's really becoming crazy. Now, here's why plutonium pit production is not only unnecessary, but I would argue even detrimental to our national security. To begin with, no future production is to maintain the safety and reliability of the existing nuclear weapons stockpile. Instead, it's all for speculative new designs. A 2006 independent study, this is a footnote, I initiated that study through then Senator Jeff Bingaman, but that study concluded that pits last at least a century in their service lives already. And a subsequent Livermore lab, that's in California, Livermore lab study concluded that plutonium lasts more than 150 years. And the average age now of plutonium pits is 40 years. There's already at least 15,000 existing pits stored at the Pantex plant near Amarillo. And here's the key point. Not only are these pits not necessary, but they will likely be heavily modified from their original designs. And this could raise reliability issues because they can't be tested because of the existing global testing moratorium. And ever so briefly, but pits have to perfectly symmetrically implode. And any deviation from their original design could perturb that, could, make it behave differently. That's why it could degrade national security. Or in the alternative, it could prompt the US to resume testing, after which all of the other nuclear weapons powers are going to start testing. You can be pretty well assured of that. So clearly that would have very severe international non-proliferation programs. Now, I stated, I forget which meeting I was in. I'm sorry, it was in a previous meeting, but I was pointing out how we really have to move from moral platitudes to action. That's what we need to do. And so first of all, as a motivational piece, I'm throwing in there, why is nuclear disarmament necessary? And perhaps it's obvious. The Archbishop quoted Robert McNamara. I'm expanding those quotes a little bit right here. I'm not going to read them verbatim, but recall that Robert McNamara was defense secretary to Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he's saying that it was only luck that allowed us to survive the Cuban Missile Crisis. And people generally don't know this, but there were two crises over Berlin that are more or less regarded as, I would say, as nearly as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a crisis in 1983 when the Soviet Union misread a NATO nuclear exercise and thought that it was a ruse that was going to result in a preemptive strike. I could cite other instances. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were 3 Soviet submarine officers that had to vote on whether to hit a US Navy destroyer during the blockade with a nuclear torpedo. One guy voted against, and that was 1 out of 3, to not shoot that nuclear torpedo against a US naval torpedo. That's how close it came during the Cuban Missile Crisis. McNamara found out years later that the US had a bunch of tactical nukes in Cuba that, had America invaded, would have used on the American troops, et cetera, et cetera. Bottom line, we've come very close, a dozen times or more. Okay, as further, well, this is more encouragement about what activists have done to date. The National Nuclear Security Administration has tried 4 times to expand plutonium pit production, and we've been able to beat them each time. But this 5th time is by far the most serious. And there's a wonderful, well, I should say it's a mixed law, but it is a wonderful law, federal law, the National Environmental Policy Act, that the government has to allow the opportunity for the public to comment on its major proposals. Well, it's not doing it on this 5th time around for pit production. And my organization and 2 colleagues have sued for that nationwide environmental impact statement. And just yesterday, court in South Carolina rejected NNSA's motion to dismiss our lawsuit. So I'm kind of crowing about that. That feels good. Now, in what to do, definitely discuss Archbishop Wester's pastoral letter. And it's just been a real blessing, real pleasing to kind of see it ripple out from its release date of January 11th, 2022, that more people are becoming more aware of it. Somebody in the previous meeting that the Archbishop and I had observed how the Archbishop is becoming ever more popular, ever more speaking engagements, et cetera. But again, it's rippling out. I can see that it's had a pretty profound impact on, for example, Pax Christi. And I hope it ripples beyond, just the world of the Catholic Church in the USA. I believe it is. I want to underline, don't underestimate the mundane. Just talking to your neighbors in your parishes and letters to the editor, op-eds, radio talk shows. Before the pandemic, I used to go to Washington 3-4 times a year. And I've had congressional staff tell me this is New Mexican congressional staff, but they're reading the letters to the editors every day and reporting to their bosses how many there are, et cetera. So they have more impact than you might think. Big ticket items support the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And I'm proud to point out that, first of all, the Vatican was one of the prime movers and shakers in the formulation of that treaty to begin with, co-organizing it with the United Nations, and then was the first to sign and ratify the treaty. So my point is perhaps obvious, but it would be completely in alignment with the Vatican and the Pope to support that ban treaty. Contemporary to today, Representative McGovern of Massachusetts and Blumenauer of Oregon, they just submitted House Resolution 77, calling on the United States to embrace the treaty, which will never happen in the near term. But this is important messaging, and it's crucial that we influence our congressional offices. I want to highly recommend those 2 books right there, The Doomsday Machine by Daniel Ellsberg and The Bomb by Fred Kaplan. Very worthwhile reading. The Archbishop can attest to how effective The Doomsday Machine is. That is one hell of a book. So I definitely recommend reading that. The Archbishop, I'm expanding on something he's already said. It's my view, even as a non-Catholic, but that the issue of nuclear disarmament should definitely be regarded within the Catholic Church and all faiths, for that matter, as a pro-life issue. And I'm not going to read through all these horrific effects But this is what you can expect from a 300 kiloton ICBM warhead on New York City. And this is what you can expect from an all-out war between US and Russia. And if you go read that book, The Doomsday Machine by Daniel Ellsberg, and you'll see that all-out nuclear war is far more likely than a limited war. There's probably no such thing as a limited nuclear war, and that the ladder of escalation will be inevitable, which is just an absolutely frightening thought. And I'm not so sanguine about the war in Ukraine, by the way. If the Ukrainians begin to take back Crimea, for example, I don't know what Putin's going to do. So let's just be aware of all these dangers. Now, I've done a little bit of research on the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and this is actually a declared position of that conference in 2019. And so you can see that the conference, very good language here. I have to observe, unfortunately, I don't see any action. And I know Archbishop is beginning to do what he can to try and change that. But rather than look at the glass half empty, let's look at it as half full. This is a declared position. If there was, I would call it grassroots pressure from within the Catholic world in the US on the conference to, do more than rhetoric here, that would be a good thing. I'm going to end up closing with a specific suggestion. Again, looking at this USCCB strategic plan, which y'all can find on the net, by the way, that's how I found it. But I took interest in its second declared priority about the life and dignity of the human person, and which was, given more detailed explanation as defending the right to life for all people, the unborn, et cetera, fight the advance of abortion, infanticide, suicide, euthanasia, and the death penalty. Well, I want to suggest that weapons of mass destruction should be added to all that. And that would be a very solid step, I think, for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to undertake. Obviously I'm tailoring my presentation to my audience which is Catholic. But this would be, I think, just a tremendous thing if there was grassroots Catholic pressure upon the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to expand its definition of defending the right to life to include weapons of mass destruction. I kind of contend that, that's kind of a no-brainer, actually, but getting it done is another matter. And with that, I will close. As I stated earlier, I look forward to Q&A. One thing I'm going to do, I was supposed to meet somebody, but I'll tell them to move on and that I can meet with them later. So I can go ahead and stay a bit later. And with that, I close and I will stop my screen sharing. And I want to thank the Archbishop again for just the wonderful relationship we have, and the fact that we actually seem to be making some impact, or beginning to, which is very, very pleasing. So thank you all.
Thank you, Archbishop John and Jay. I so appreciate what you have provided for us. I appreciate that you've become friends. And I really am glad that there is an ecumenical effort. I am involved in interfaith ecumenical ministry, and I promise to try to get it beyond the Catholic Church as well. So thank you for your friendship and your work together. We like to spend the next amount of time with Q&A. And Jay, if you can look in the chat, if you saw in the chat, Mark has given us about 3 or 4 things to reflect upon. So maybe we can start there.
Well, first of all, concerning the first question, the war in Ukraine, the pastoral letter is, after all, the Archbishop's. And Archbishop, I'm not trying to foist a tough question. I'm not trying to dodge a tough question, but I think perhaps you should address it first, and I could add to it if need be.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you for the question. I saw at the very beginning, of course, and it's a very good question. And nor do I want to dodge the question, but so living in our pastoral letter, we said that you quoted it very well. I do believe that we need to jettison the just war theory. I think that's true, especially today with nuclear weapons. If you look at all, and I've given talks on that before, of how if you look at all the provisions of the just war with nuclear weapons, there's just no way you can, there's just no such thing. You're not allowed to kill people. That's exactly right. Now, the war in Ukraine, I think this is something that's that I grapple with. I think it's important to say in the outset, the Catholic Church has never been totally pacifist. In other words, the church has never taught that, to my understanding, and that's still the case today from a moral point of view. However, I think that, you know, this is something that's evolving. If you look at the gospel, I think it's quite clear that Jesus proclaimed peace, that we are to be peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. So, and I think this is an individual decision and a communal one, but on the individual level, I think that has to be, you know, I think a commitment that we make. For example, if you were in a situation where you could, you had some loved ones who were going to be killed by an assailant, or you were going to be killed by an assailant, and you had the capacity to kill the assailant first, what would you do? You know, now the teaching of the church has always said you have a right to self-defense, that you can defend yourself. And of course, the thinking is the intention, your intention is to save your life. It's not to kill another human being, but in saving your life, you're going to kill another human being. So from a moral perspective, that's, you know, something that in my mind, you know, you have to look at. I could see somebody saying, no, I've made the commitment because of the gospel that I would not kill that person. I would allow myself to be killed. And that's a personal decision to make. And that would be taking it, you know, all the way. And I think you could say that you would be saying, when Jesus said, no one has a greater love than this than to lay down your life for a friend. In essence, you're laying down your life for an enemy. And Jesus also said, love your enemies. So that's, now you can expand that moral hypothetical and say, what if it was your loved ones that you could save? What if there were 5 loved ones you could save by killing the one assailant? Again, I think there are people who would say, I just would not kill anybody, period. What happens, happens, and that would be regrettable, but that would be the way it is. So those are personal decisions. On a geopolitical level, with Ukraine, certainly, and I keep looking, you know, I think, you know, it's you know, as you know, the Pope has not, to my knowledge, and maybe I have not seen anything, you know, he has not, and the Ukrainians were upset about this a while, you remember, he has not lashed out against Russia. And maybe I'm sure there are many reasons why that is, you know, behind the scenes. I know the Pope wants to see himself as possibly a peacemaker. If he's made himself available, if that could ever happen. It doesn't look plausible right now, but we don't know down the line. So I know that he's got many, many things to be thinking of in all of this. So, you know, certainly the church would teach officially that the Ukrainian people have a right to defend themselves. But again, you know, you can look at it morally. If they, let's suppose that Vladimir, you know, Zelensky just gave up. He said, okay, we're not going to fight back. You know, well, obviously there'd be people alive today that are now dead if that was the decision. And I'm sure there'd be a lot of guerrilla warfare, much like we saw in Afghanistan I'm sure that would ensue probably. So these are very difficult decisions, but I think that the gospel is definitely a gospel of peace. I think we're called to be peacemakers. I think that has to be our ultimate, destiny, our ultimate decision. How you apply that in an individual case, either personally or on a geopolitical level, that's something that people have to come to on their own, or countries have to come to on their own. So I hope I didn't dodge the question. I hope I'm at once trying to stand by the statement, because I do stand by it. But as in many moral, theological, and moral questions, one has to apply those principles in a given circumstance, and you need to take in, God, the context, the law, and the personal uniqueness of that situation. There are things you have to take; those things you have to take into account in making an ethical decision. So I don't think it's ever going to be easy, and I think it's always going to be difficult. I've met people who've told me point blank that they would die before they would kill the peace, and I admire that. I mean, that's a definite commitment to the gospel of peace. But I don't believe that every Catholic is bound by that morally, according to Catholic teaching.
Jay, we have, please explain how the U.S. war planners have been climbing the ladder of escalation dominance in Ukraine.
Okay, I'll do that. And I also think I could address the next two questions kind of all bundled up together.
Good.
First of all, I didn't mean to say U.S. war planners climbing the ladder of escalation dominance in Ukraine. In any event, what I meant to say, what I was referring to was the ladder of escalation once a nuke was used, and that there is no such thing, or there's very unlikely to be any such thing as a limited war. And my belief in that is mainly formed by Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine. So if you want to know about what is pretty much the inevitable ladder of escalation once a nuke is used, read that book. And Daniel Ellsberg, of course, he's famous for having released the Pentagon Papers, but he was actually a nuclear war planner at the RAND Corporation and consultant to the US government. And he knows what he's talking about. So again, I highly recommend that book. But again, the bottom line is it's unlikely that there's any such thing as a limited nuclear war. And once it happens, it goes all out. So that's my answer to that question. The next question is tough. What do you think the US response should be if Russia was to use a nuke? I'm just giving you my personal opinion. I'm definitely not speaking for the Archbishop or even my organization. I think there should be an overwhelming conventional response from NATO. On an interesting note, I already said my father was a full colonel in the US Army. And he said to me one time, we don't think the Russian military is actually that good, but we don't want to find out the hard way. And it's kind of been shown in the Ukraine war that, yeah, the Russian military is not exactly the feared, if you take away its nukes, it's not exactly the feared military machine that you would have thought before the war. I actually think that NATO could quickly destroy Russian forces. But would that cause Putin to drop more nukes? I'm afraid the answer could quite well be yes. So, boy, I have no great answer for that. Putin would have to be answered, because what's the alternative if NATO and the US did nothing. What does that mean? And like I've already, as I stated in my presentation, Putin has turned the notion or the theory of deterrence upside down on its head. We're in new uncharted territory. This is not good, and it's not reassuring. And I lose some sleep over it. I take it very, very seriously. I will just close that subject by repeating something would have to be done. You can't do nothing. That's my view. And I'm afraid it's going to have to be a military response, but there are no good answers. And speaking of no good answers, somebody asked me to restate the effects of nuclear weapons. So briefly, I'm looking at my slide again. A 300 kiloton warhead on New York City. 300 kilotons is roughly 15 times the blasts in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And a 300 kiloton weapon is quite common nowadays. But there'd be a 3-mile blast radius, would destroy almost all structures. Direct radiation within a 1-mile radius, lethal fallout thousands of miles downwind, mass fire within a radius of at least 3 miles, 1 million dead, twice as many injuries in the first 24 hours. Now, with an all-out nuclear war between US and Russia, at least 360 million quick deaths. The international economic system would utterly collapse. Medical infrastructure would be incapable of addressing the scale of suffering. 5 billion people dead from starvation because of a nuclear winter. Some people say all-out nuclear war would kill the planet. That's not true. The planet's going to go on revolving around the sun. And some human civilization might survive in the southern hemisphere, but the great majority of humans, and therefore civilization, would be wiped out in an all-out nuclear war. So all of that's pretty well known. By the way, the whole thing about nuclear war has really only emerged in the last decade. The US government knew about it back in the 80s. And never saw fit to inform the citizenry. Let's see. I don't completely.
How about this one? We're getting close to closing, but I think this is important. In the discussion on Ukraine, the possibility of diplomacy to end the war has not been mentioned or given its rightful place. Why aren't we discussing diplomacy?
You want to take that, Archbishop?
Sure. I think that, I think they, from my perspective, my own opinion is that they tried diplomacy as the war was getting geared up. As you know, world leaders did talk with Putin. They came to see him. They talked to him on different means, and it was not effective. The Pope is certainly, I know others have volunteered on the world stage to use diplomacy, but my understanding is that this is something that that Putin is not listening to right now. I think if they can get someone to get through to him, possibly, but I think they just feel that Putin has to have a way of saving face, and he doesn't want to lose this, so it seems diplomacy is not on the table right now. But perhaps those wiser than I, but I do agree with that. I mean, that we've got to learn to start talking with one another before we start bombing one another. But we're dealing with a very specific situation here, and the motivation for Putin is mixed. There are some people who see that he's right. I mean, there are people who think that he's right to be concerned about NATO having nuclear weapons so close to his country, just as we were concerned when Russia was doing it in Cuba. So, and there are people who look at the history of it all, and I've been called, what was I called once, a historical neocon. I'm not quite sure how that works. I have to But it's so anyway, it's complicated, but I think you're quite right to point to that. But it doesn't appear that diplomacy is in the cards right now, sadly.
Well, great. Thank you so much. And we'll preserve all these questions, and we'll be announcing a possibility as well for an opportunity for open discussion in just a moment. But Archbishop John or Jay, do you have any closing comments that you'd like to offer us?
Well, I would just like to thank all of you, your association, for all that you do in many regards of Catholic social teaching, and particularly in this issue. It's very encouraging to me, and I know to Jay and so many, that you're so interested in this issue and working so hard on it. And again, I think I'm open. I'm glad we could have these conversations. I think we need to help each other to see how we can get people to engage this conversation, to really move this to the next level, to the next step. I liken it sometimes, my nephew, I love him dearly, and he smokes cigarettes. He's lives in Italy, and I guess they have more smokers there. And it's kind of, how do you convince somebody, who's healthy, and there are people who dodge the bullet and who smoked all their lives and somehow seem to get away with it. And there is that mentality that, well, we've been dealing with this since 1945, and we can get away with it. And how we can convince people of the urgency, of the importance of nuclear disarmament, that, in my mind, and even with the laboratory, we're trying to establish some conversations with the scientists and all. But initially, I'm already getting people say, well, I agree with you. We do need to do it, but how are we going to get there? Looking at the world today is certainly, doesn't look very plausible. So I think that's, to my mind, to really get people engaged, to really speak to their hearts. We know from research that speaking logically doesn't change hearts. We have to get to people's hearts if they're going to really engage this issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to say, Jay?
Yeah, I'll start with saying something that's no doubt obvious, but nevertheless needs to be underlined. Nuclear weapons are a completely different class of weapons, even beyond chemical and biological, and obviously beyond conventional weapons. And I can't say the Einstein quote itself, but he observed early on, we now have the wisdom to invent these weapons, but not the wisdom to control them. And if you read those two books that I recommended, and this comes from other things I read, when you're in the world of nuclear war planners, it kind of seems utterly logical when you're with the granular details and it's step by step and blah, blah, blah. And, we'll do this because they might do that. On the face of it, it seems logical. When you step back from it, it's utterly mad. And I use that acronym intentionally because of the old mutually assured destruction. Now it's kind of like multilaterally assured destruction. But if you know anything about Zen koans, we're posing a problem or a question that in a way doesn't have a logical or intellectual answer. We do have to speak to the heart, like the Archbishop just said. But I would suggest that basically the human race needs to take even a transcendental jump here in order to survive and relinquish these weapons. Now, I don't want to go la-la or woo-woo on you, because at the same time that we take this giant leap forward, it's going to take all of these small, deliberate, practical steps to do it. And to do it also means engaging, first of all, in public education, talking to your neighbors, talking to your parishes, talking to your politicians, and in particular, talking to Congress and your congressional delegations. And see, I know from, I can only estimate that I've had 200 visits with congressional staff. So I have some idea of what congressional offices respond to. And one of them is, of course, lobbyist pressure, but grassroots pressure is really, really important. So anyway, just to conclude, we humans as a race, in order to survive, and it's already been said, luck is not a strategy, but in order to survive, we are going to have to take that transcendental leap that's required to rise above and retire, get rid of, eradicate this entire class of weapons. But in order to do that, it's going to take us putting our shoulders to the wheel and completing the practical steps that need to be done. Most of all, get active.
Here in the Pittsburgh area, Paul Dordal, who's on our call tonight too, initiated through his study of the campaign for the abolition of nuclear weapons, their research about financial institutions that were involved with investing in the manufacture of nuclear weapons. And on that list is our own PNC, which is now the 5th largest US bank. So for over 4 years, maybe it's longer, we have been petitioning, meeting with, having shareholders resolutions, etc., seeking PNC's policy to divest themselves of these over $2 billion of investments. And we invite you to look us up on Facebook. I put a message there in the chat. And wherever you are in the United States, if you have PNC, you can get involved in the dialogue. And everyone here tonight, if you have not, to sign the petition and publicly say your own opinion about nuclear weapons on that website. And that's www.abetterpncbnk.org. Bernie, add if you will.
No, I think you touched all the bases. I hope that next week we will have a chance for people to go into greater detail about how we can really take on PNC Bank as a local expression. Local is now national, but we can have leverage not only through over our politicians. I think the economic institutions like PNC are where we will be able to have an influence. So till next week, let's continue this discussion.
Thank you, Joyce and Bernie. We wanted you to know that on the Association of Pittsburgh website, there is comments about Archbishop John and his story of how he's come to embrace this and become his prophetic self. So we encourage you to do that. I would also suggest to get on the and Google Pax Christi USA. There's many materials of prayer, study, and action that will help you. I would also offer, if any of the groups that you're associated with would like a member of our local Pax Christi or the Association of Pittsburgh Priests to facilitate a session on this, please invite us. And I also wanted to share that many decades ago, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Baden made a corporate stance against nuclear proliferation, and we've claimed our Mother House grounds as a nuclear-free zone. So many decades ago, we knew that this is something that we needed to address. So I think it's time to renew that commitment upon all of us and declare wherever we reside as nuclear-free zones.